here and those of you who are tuning into the live stream. We get to work through the book of Deuteronomy this morning, everyone's favorite book to read. Take up and read from the Old Testament. But let me open this in prayer, and then we'll kind of march through this very important book from the Old Testament. But Heavenly Father, we thank you for your written word and how you have instructed us in it and through it, and how you have taught not only the Israelites, but indeed all of your people, that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And Lord, we want to be dependent upon you, and we ask that you would feed us, teach us, and instruct us now by the wisdom of your word and by the power of your Spirit. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, the book of Deuteronomy is perhaps one of the most important book in the Old Testament, maybe the most important. And it's going to be the culmination of the Torah, the final book in that first five books portion written by Moses, and it's going to be written to the second generation of Israel. And when Moses is writing Deuteronomy, they are on the plains of Moab. They are on the east side of the Jordan River, just about to go into the Promised Land. And as we studied in Numbers, Moses was not allowed to go into the Promised Land because of what took place in Numbers 20, where he, rather than speaking to the rock to bring forth water for the nation of Israel, he despised the Lord and treated God as being unholy in front of the entire congregation. And in that instance, Numbers 20 is a very important chapter because at the beginning of the chapter, Miriam dies. At the end of that chapter, Aaron's life is taken from him in judgment from what took place when Moses struck the rock, because both he and Aaron were a part of that. So Aaron dies in that same chapter, and then Moses makes it a little bit longer till the end of Deuteronomy, which is maybe a month or two later. And so it's a significant chapter, and it's a major turning point. And so Deuteronomy is really Moses's final work, his last words to the nation. And if you look there on your paper at the purpose, you see that the bigger theme is the renewed covenant, and Deuteronomy literally means the second giving of the law. And the purpose is to exhort the second generation of Israelites to be faithful to Yahweh and to the Mosaic Covenant, so that they might go in and possess the land, though he foretold that Israel would fail to obey Yahweh in the land and would experience the curses of the covenant rather than the blessings. So it was written by Moses, probably close to 1406, and that's at the time of his death and just before they enter into the Promised Land. You see the chart there. I won't spend too much time on the chart because we're just going to walk through the book and walk through in kind of outline form what you see there in the chart. But if you look down below the chart to the key themes, these are the themes that are repeated over and over again in this book, and I think that the main thing that jumps off the page, and I had my brand new LSB translation of the Bible when we read through Deuteronomy earlier this year, and over again I highlighted and underlined this phrase, your God. The Lord your God, Yahweh your God, is said over and over and over again. In fact, that term, your God, is used 270 times in the book, highlighting Israel's unique relationship to Yahweh. And they are in covenant relationship with one another. And that is emphasized over and over again by Moses. He wants Israel to understand their relationship with God and all of the implications of it. And then Roman numeral 2 there, you see the attributes of Yahweh and a lot of references there. What's going to be amazing is that as the way that Moses weaves together theology and the application of theology. The commands that are given to the nation of Israel are always interwoven with who God is. And because God is like this, you are to respond to him in this way. And also, if you're familiar and have read through the book of Isaiah, you'll see that so much of what Isaiah says, a book that's very rich in theology about who God is, Isaiah is going to quote and build off of Moses repeatedly in his theology and what Moses establishes in concerning God's character in the book of Deuteronomy. Isaiah is going to build upon and quote and cite repeatedly in his writings. But the attributes of Yahweh that are on continuous display is the number one, the reality that God is unique, there is none like him, and that he is a jealous God. And again, because God is a jealous God, what should Israel do? How should Israel respond to that character attribute of God? They should be faithful because God is a jealous God and he's called them to be his people. If they are unfaithful, that will lead to their discipline and their judgment. God is also held up as being faithful, that God will maintain his portion of the covenant. He will not break his word. He is held up as loving and kind. He is held out as gracious. He gives to the people of Israel what they do not deserve. And so over and over again, this is presenting the character of God. And even Moses, all of his theology about God is really going to be built upon what we saw back in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, where God himself, as he passed by Moses, and Moses says, I want to see your glory. And God says, you can't handle the glory, but I'll pass by. And God announces, or God's autobiography, is a very important passage. And if you turn back there, you see so much of what is repeated by Moses in Deuteronomy just builds upon God's own self-revelation back in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. Then Yahweh passed by in front of him and called out, Yahweh, Yahweh God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, and who forgives iniquity and transgression and sin. And yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. So all of those attributes that are continually held up in Deuteronomy really go back in our expansions, or building upon what God said about himself in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. So we see that the character attributes of Yahweh are going to be continually repeated. And then in the same way, since Moses is building upon his theology to his application, because God is this way, then the application and the response of Israel is also going to be continually highlighted. And you see that in Roman numeral 3 of what is required of Israel. If you turn to chapter 10, verses 12 and 13, we have kind of a summary verse that's going to encapsulate a lot, but there are also a lot of summary verses in the book of Deuteronomy that we could turn to. But the requirements of Israel, ultimately, they are said to be that they are called to fear Yahweh, to love him, to keep his commandments, to walk in his ways, to serve him, to hear and to obey. And in a Hebrew mindset, to hear implies obedience. And if you haven't obeyed, then you haven't heard. And all of the parents in the room said, amen. I heard you, then why aren't you obeying? Why aren't you doing what I said? If you heard, then there's a duty to obey. But look with me at Deuteronomy chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. It says, so now Israel, what does Yahweh your God ask from you but to fear Yahweh your God, to walk in all his ways and love him, and to serve Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of Yahweh and his statutes, which I am commanding you today for your good. And what we saw also there, and what Moses is addressing, Moses is not merely seeking that Israel would outwardly conform to some type of mere external obedience to God. Moses is not here just before he dies saying, hey, can you guys give a veneer of obedience to God? Can you give him lip service and act like you, even if you don't really mean it? Can you just act like you're going to obey? Can you give him God that much? No. Moses is continually driving at the need for Israel to obey, love, serve, walk after, and with God with their entire heart, with all their soul. And again, this is going to be present in the great Shema of Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord with all your heart, soul, and strength, and that's going to be a recurring theme. And as you look at there on Roman numeral 4, look at how many occasions Moses speaks about the heart. And a recurring theme there is also going to be that they need a new heart. If we are still there in Deuteronomy 10, we just continue down, verse 14. Behold, to Yahweh your God belong heaven and the highest heavens, and the earth and all that is in it. Yet on your fathers did Yahweh set his affection to love them, and he chose their seed after them, even you above all peoples, as it is this day. So circumcise your heart and stiffen your neck no longer. Well, now how do you do that? And that picture and that illusion of the circumcision of the heart, of cut away what ought not to be there, cut away the sin that is internal, but you can't do open heart surgery on yourself. So what is Moses speaking about? Well, he'll get to that at the end of the book, and we'll look at that in a bit. But that is what Moses is going to be continually addressing throughout these 34 chapters. And then there's also the recurring theme as they are on the brink of going into the promised land. They're going to cross over in the book of Joshua. But Moses is continually speaking about when you go in to possess the land. They haven't conquered it yet, but Moses says, God has given this to you. It is your inheritance. You are going to possess it, and this is what you are to do once you have gone into the land. You are to act and live and worship in this way. And so the possession of the land is going to be a recurring theme as well. Now, if you turn over to Deuteronomy 1, what I would like to do is just kind of walk our way through the book. We're not going to read every verse, but I would like to walk through and just show you, give you the lay of the land of what is taking place. Ultimately, if you look back up to the chart on the top of the page, you'll see the book really breaks down into 3 major sections, but 5 major speeches. The first portion is going to be looking backwards at what God has done for Israel. It's going to be basically giving a history from Mount Sinai until the present moment when they are on the plains of Moab, about to go into the promised land. The end of chapter 4 through the end of chapter 28 is going to be one long speech, and you can think of these as sermons that Moses gave just before he died. And so the majority of the book is going to be unfolding and talking about the stipulations of the Mosaic Covenant, what God is now calling Israel to do and what he is calling them to be. And then the third portion of the book looks to the future. So if 1 through 4 is the past, 4 through 28 is what God is calling them to then in the present. And then Moses is going to look to the future. And there's going to be 3 speeches in that portion of looking to the future. And we'll look at those as we get there. But if you look down now at the walking through Deuteronomy portion, and looking at the first section of what God has done, verses 1 through 5 give us the setting for the entire book. If you look at verse 3, now it happened in the 40th year on the first day of the 11th month. And that is reckoning time from the day of the Exodus, going back to Exodus 12. So Moses has kept track of all of the days and all of the years and months. And I think the hours are footnoted in the Hebrew, but no, just kidding. But the setting is given to us there in verses 1 through 5. And then verse 6 is going to give the introduction to Moses' first speech. or verse 5, that across the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moses undertook to expound this law, saying, and then verse 6 is going to begin that process of looking backwards. And if you didn't read Numbers carefully, you'll be really confused here at the beginning of Deuteronomy. I remember in seminary when I had to read all of the books of the Bible twice before each class session in our Old Testament studies. I was reading through Deuteronomy, and because I was probably kind of drowsy as I read through Numbers, I was like, who are these guys, Sihon and Og? They keep being mentioned over and over and over again. And what is being said? And so they're going to be mentioned repeatedly. Moses begins by looking at Israel's rebellion in Numbers 14 at Kadesh Barnea. So that's when they were first supposed to go up and enter into the land. And there were 12 spies, and 10 of them came back and said they gave a bad report, and they said, we can't do this. That was the bad report. Not that there were giants in the land. There were giants in the land. That part was accurate. But the fact that they said, we can't do this, and God's not going to strengthen us, and we're not going to be victorious, that was the bad report. But Joshua and Caleb, two of the spies, they said, no, we can do this because Yahweh has promised us victory. But at that point in time, that's when they were judged for their unbelief, and they had to wander in the wilderness, so that entire generation died. And Moses reminds them of that. And remember, Moses is writing to the second generation, so he's like, hey, remember what cost your parents their lives. That's kind of what the beginning of Deuteronomy is about. Remember the judgment that came upon your parents because of their unbelief and their refusal to obey God. Now, if you're a member of the second generation, that hits home, right? You've grown up in the wilderness because of your parents' disobedience. You've seen an entire generation die out. None of them lived to an old age because of their disobedience in the wilderness. And Moses reminds them about that. And then he also recounts the victory. So in Numbers 21, so after that important chapter of Numbers 20, where Miriam and Aaron die and Moses is condemned to death, Numbers 21, you're going to see, if you look back there, Numbers 21, beginning in verse 21, it says, the victories over Sihon and Og, those are the kings of the Amorites that were in the land, and they were on the east side of the Jordan River. So Israel is going to go up, and they're going to conquer those lands on the east side of the Jordan River, and you're going to have some of the tribes, or 2.5 tribes, say, hey, this land looks pretty good. Can we just settle here? And God says, okay, that's fine, but when we go in to conquer the land, the men of those tribes must come with us into battle and conquer, and they leave behind their wives and their little ones, and they are going to be a part of the conquest. And that's what we're going to see in the book of Joshua. But we see Moses reminding them of the disobedience, and then he also reminds them of the victory. Look, God can bring victory, and he can lead you to possess this land. You've already seen him do that by conquering Sihon and Og. And so there's a foretaste and a foreshadowing, and Moses is reminding them of that. Hey, stick with Yahweh. If you abandon him, there's going to be judgment, but if you stick with him and follow and obey him and love him, you are going to possess the land to his glory and for your good. That is what is laid out. And then what's interesting, at the end of chapter 3, you have Moses coming back to God and asking for mercy. He said, God, I know you've said that I'm not able to enter into the land. Can I please? And the Lord says no. And he says, no, this is not for you to enter into the land. And it's an interesting reality of Moses pleading and the Lord saying no. There's not too many occasions of a faithful man pleading for mercy and the Lord saying no. At this point in time, you're going to receive the punishment that was initially dealt out. So a lot there that we'll pass over for now. But then in the first part of chapter 4, Moses is going to exhort Israel to be faithful to Yahweh. And this is seen in verses 1 through 40. And there's a key passage there. I'm on the back page now. A key passage there in chapter 4, verse 2. You shall not add to the word which I am commanding you, nor take away from it, that you may keep the commandments of Yahweh your God, which I am commanding you. Don't take away what God has commanded, and don't add to it either. The law is a final unit from Moses, and all of the other Old Testament revelation that's going to come in the future. You're like, well, isn't that adding to it? It's like, actually, it's only going to be building upon it. Even as I said, where did Isaiah get his theology? From Moses. Where did Moses get his theology? From God in Exodus 34 verses 6 and 7. So there's going to be a layering on top, and really an expansion of things, but there's not going to be anything that's going to truly be new. There's going to be expansions, but it's going to build upon itself. And so that's going to be key. And then at the end of this portion, there's going to be another little narrative portion, verses 41 to 43. Since Israel had conquered that land on the east side of the Jordan, there was also going to be the establishment of the refuge, cities of refuge there. And so those have been established, and those were an important part of Israel's kind of secular government, so to speak. Not secular because they were a theocracy, but just important part of justice in the land. And those cities were set up, and that is a pattern that Moses is helping to establish of, hey, you've conquered the land, and now you need to begin to order and orchestrate yourselves according to what God has revealed in his word. And part of that is being ready for living life and being ready to carry out justice in the land, and that involved the cities of refuge. And now in verse 44 in chapter 4, we are coming to that major portion of Deuteronomy of what God expects of Israel. And this is from 444 to the end of chapter 28. And 44 through 49 is actually going to be explaining what Moses is setting before Israel. And it's worth reading. Now, this is the law which Moses set before the sons of Israel. And these are the testimonies and the statutes and the judgments which Moses spoke to the sons of Israel when they came out from Egypt across the Jordan in the valley opposite Beth Peor, in the land of Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon, whom Moses and the sons of Israel struck down when they came out from Egypt. And they took possession of his land and the land of Og, king of Bashan, the two kings of the Amorites who were across the Jordan to the east toward the sunrise. And so you have Moses setting out what is going to be commanded of the nation of Israel moving forward as they possess the land. And now if you look at the handout there, this is where we'll start to move faster. And within this, what you're going to see in this second speech, in chapter 5, verse 1 through 11:32, Moses is going to be giving repeated exhortations for Israel to obey the law. And the law is going to be built upon the Ten Commandments. And those are going to be reiterated and given for a second time in Deuteronomy 5, verses 1 through 21. And those are repeated from Exodus chapter 20. And really, the Ten Commandments are built and premised upon God's order in creation. Okay, the first two commandments really point back to the distinction that God made between himself and his creation on the first 2 days in Genesis 1 and 2. If you look at these commandments, so Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 8. You shall not make for yourself an idol, any likeness of what is in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. And how did God create on the first 2 days? He was separating the heavens from the waters, and he separated out the land from the waters. And so you see the same categories. Moses is building back and pointing back to God's original creation. And because there was a distinction between the Creator who made the heavens and the earth and the waters, we are not to worship as the creator anything that comes from what God has created. And there's going to be a building upon, really all of the Ten Commandments build upon God's original creation. Why are we not to murder? Because God has created us in His image. And we see that explained to us not only in Genesis 1, but also in Genesis 9, when God tells Noah to be fruitful and multiply, the same command that He gave to Adam and Eve. He says, if anyone takes man's life, his life shall be taken, because he's killed somebody in the image of God. And so we will get into that now, but that's an interesting study in terms of seeing how everything builds upon what is previous, and it brings a lot more importance to the original creation. Why is Israel to keep the Sabbath day? What's the pattern that they're following there? God's working and creating for 6 days, and then what did God do on the seventh day? He rested. So you see all of these things are expanding and building upon really previous revelation. But in chapter 5, verses 1 through 21, the Ten Commandments are going to be repeated. That's worth marking and being familiar with in your Bible. If you turn over to Deuteronomy 6, and hopefully this is already marked, but verses 4 through 9 are some of the most important verses in the entire scriptures. When Jesus was asked in Matthew 22, what is the greatest commandment? What was his answer? He's quoting and citing Deuteronomy. This very command in Deuteronomy 6:5, you shall love Yahweh your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And then, again, bridging this reality of God's character, we see God's character in verse 4, right? Because God is one, and He is the God of Israel. He is our God. Yahweh is one. What are they to do? They are to love Him. And then even more of a response in verses 6 through 9. These words which I am commanding you today shall be on your heart, and you shall teach them diligently to your sons, and shall speak of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise up. And so there was to be a culture, they were to be a nation of discipleship. They were to be constantly teaching and training up the next generation, so that the next generation understood who God was and how they were to respond to God based upon His character. And so that's a very, very important passage. I didn't have... key thing to remember, the passages that are not on the paper as being key passages doesn't mean that they're not important. There's a lot of passages all throughout Deuteronomy. I didn't, just for the sake of space, I was like, I can put everything on here, but Deuteronomy 8:3 is another important passage. It's not on our sheet, but that's what Jesus is going to quote when He is tempted by Satan in the wilderness. When He is tempted to turn the stones into bread after being in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights. He says basically, no, I get my sustenance and I survive because of who God is and how He has revealed Himself to me in His Word. And it also shows you the purpose of trials and testing. Speaking to Israel in Deuteronomy 8:3, and He humbled you and let you be hungry and fed you with manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that He might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by everything that proceeds out of the mouth of Yahweh. And so there are a lot of important verses all throughout Deuteronomy. So don't let my fast pace lead you to believe, well, I can skip over everything that's not mentioned. It's like, no. There's so much here. And like I said, this is perhaps the most important book in the Old Testament. And as you understand Deuteronomy better, the entire Old Testament will make more and more sense. Another key passage we already looked at in chapter 10, verses 12 to 13, what Yahweh expects from Israel, and then also that exhortation to circumcise their heart, which He's going to return to later on in the book. Now, if you look with me, beginning in verse 12, so Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 1 through really the end of chapter 26 is going to be Moses preaching on the Ten Commandments. And this is fascinating to realize, again, as you kind of see these different tiers. And the Ten Commandments we're building upon what? God's original creation. So God gave those commandments based upon his original creation, and Moses is now going to preach on those 10 commandments. Let me show you how much those commands and what that looks like to apply them in a broad categories of life. And it helps to make sense of things and the way that things are ordered in the commands as you look at them this way. And it also kind of stretch and challenge your thinking of why is he, if this is the context, why is he saying this? And we'll look at that. But in chapter 12, Moses is going to address the first and second commands, which are dealing with worship. This is how Israel is to worship God. And if you look at the beginning of chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, when they go into the land, what are they commanded to do? Tear down the idols. Okay, don't worship as the Canaanites have worshipped. You are to destroy. You shall utterly destroy all the places where the nations whom you shall dispossess serve their gods, on the high mountains and on the hills and under every green tree. And you shall tear down their altars and shatter their sacred pillars and burn their Asherim with fire. And you shall cut the graven images of their gods in pieces and destroy their name from that place. And you shall not do thus toward Yahweh your God, but you shall seek Yahweh at the place Yahweh your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling. And you shall come, and there you shall come, and there you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, your tithes, the contribution of your hand, your votive offerings, your free will offerings, and the firstborn of your herd and of your flock. And so you see this exhortation of not only are they to tear down the idols of the nations, but they are to set up and establish worship as God has commanded them back in the book of Exodus and Leviticus. They're to set up the tabernacle in a place that will be revealed in the future. And ultimately, what will that place be? In Jerusalem. During the time of the judges and the David, the tabernacle is going to be in Shiloh, and that's going to be for a long period of time. But ultimately, it's going to the temple is going to be built in Jerusalem. That's going to be the place where the Lord has chosen. But chapter 12 is going to emphasize worship, and it's going to be exhorting Israel to worship God as He has described and commanded in His Word, and again building upon the first and second commandments. In chapter 13 verse 1 through 14 verse 21. It really is going to be an exposition of the Third Commandment, dealing with not taking the Lord's name in vain. And it's also going to deal with commitment, because ultimately we kind of think of not taking the Lord's name in vain, of using it lightly or saying it lightly. Don't use it as a curse word. And that is true. We should not take God's name in that way. But also, what's the recurring theme in the book of Deuteronomy? Yahweh is described as Israel's God, your God. And so when Israel is identifying and saying we are with Yahweh, they are taking his name upon themselves. And so if they do that lightly or in a way that doesn't portray God accurately to the nations, they have taken God's name in vain, right? If you are a follower of Christ, what are you called? A Christian, right? Whose name have you taken on? Yeah, don't take that name in vain. Don't take it lightly. And don't say I'm a follower of Christ. That to be a follower of Christ and not represent him well is to profane his name. What's the number one objection among unbelievers of why they will never come to church? Yeah, Christians are hypocrites. Why would I want to go and follow Jesus if that's what a follower of Jesus looks like? Again, that's being guilty of taking the name of Christ in vain. It's a breaking of the Third Commandment. And so we need to keep that in mind. And so within this portion begins with another key passage, false prophets. Verses 1 through 5 in chapter 13. Now, what do false prophets do? They take the name of the Lord in vain. They say, thus says the Lord, when the Lord has not said that. And they lead others astray in the name of God. And so God is going to address that and call Israel of what it really looks like to follow his name and not take his name lightly. and to follow through on what they have committed to and taking him on and following him. In chapter 14, verse 22 through 16, verse 17, you're going to have an exposition of the fourth commandment, which is to remember and keep the Sabbath. And wrapped up in the Sabbath is also a remembrance of the holy days and the festivals of Israel. And so Moses is going to comment and build upon that, and he's going to build upon and comment basically the rights and privileges that come with the Sabbath, the sabbatical years. And the sabbatical years, because they were not kept every 70th year, things were to revert back to the way they were when they first conquered the land. So when you bought land from somebody else in Israel, you were buying it for a period of years, knowing that on the year of Jubilee, on the 70th year, all the debts would be forgiven and the land would revert back to its ancestral inheritance. So if you were in trouble and needed to make ends meet financially, you could sell the land, but say the year of Jubilee was 20 years away, then you would calculate out how much that land was worth for the next 20 years. You would sell that to somebody. They would have the right to own and work the land for the next 20 years, but that year of Jubilee would come and that land would come back to you. That was the way that God had ordered the nation. And ultimately, Israel's not going to do that. And they forget 70 years of the land getting rest. So the year of Jubilee, all the debts were forgiven and the land would be given rest. God would provide enough for them in the 69th year where they didn't have to farm the land at all. They would have an abundance to be able to eat for a year. Like, where do I put all that food, right? But they didn't trust God in that way, and they are taken into exile for how many years? Talk to me. 70. Because for 490 years, they skipped the sabbatical year. And so God says, my land was supposed to get the rest on each of those years, and now I'm going to make sure that it gets the rest. And so he took Israel out of the land, and the land was fallow, unfarmed for 70 years while they were in exile. And he brought them back. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So that portion is an exposition on the fourth commandment. It's chapter 16, beginning in verse 18 through 18, verse 22, is an exposition of the fifth commandment. And what's the fifth commandment? That you should love and honor your father and mother. Okay, and that's really dealing with authority. And you are to honor mother and father because they themselves are a picture of the authority of God over us. And so right along those same lines, there's going to be some other key passages. In chapter 17, there's going to be, beginning of verse 14, laws concerning the king, of what the king was commanded to do. And you're like, wait, Israel doesn't have a king yet. That's correct. But Moses is going to give laws for the future king, even though there's not even a mention or a concept of a king on the plains of Moab there. But dealing with how are they to interact with that authority of the king, and what responsibilities does the king have? And that's going to be built upon and mentioned later on, because in this passage, the king is not supposed to multiply horses, wives, and silver and gold. But later on in 1 Kings, what three things is it noted that King Solomon multiplies? Chariots, yeah, gold and silver, and wives. Okay, so there's a connection being drawn by the author of Kings back to what Moses commanded for the king of Israel in Deuteronomy 17. Also in Deuteronomy 18, Moses is going to be writing about how Israel is to interact with future prophets, that they are to honor and obey a prophet who comes from Yahweh. And ultimately, there's going to be a line of prophets, who is going to culminate with the prophet, the new Moses, who's going to be to lead a new exodus of Israel, who's going to regenerate their hearts. Verses 20 through 22 are also really important because it gives us a grid to work through even now. Because if there's going to be a long line of prophets and there's going to be some false prophets who don't actually speak for God, how do we know who actually speaks for God? But the prophet who speaks a word presumptuously in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or which he speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. Now you may say in your heart, how will we know the word which Yahweh has not spoken? When a prophet speaks in the name of Yahweh, if the thing does not come about or come true, that is the thing which Yahweh has not spoken. And the prophet has spoken it presumptuously. You shall not be afraid of him. And that, when we read in 1 Kings 22, do you remember kind of we have a scene in which kind of a demonic influence and a false prophet is going to lead the king of Israel to doing something foolish. And again, we see when there's two competing claims of who's a true prophet and who's a false prophet, which one are we to believe? Well, the one who spoke what ultimately came true is the one who speaks for Yahweh and is a true prophet. So those are important passages, and that portion deals with authority. The next portion, chapter 19, verse 1 through 22, verse 8, deals with the Sixth Commandment, with homicide and dignity. And that's where we see in the beginning of chapter 19, what do you see? The laws of the city of refuge. And what is that dealing with? Homicide, manslaughter. How do you make sure that there's a fair and just trial rather than somebody being killed on accident? And then I was just listening to something on this. If somebody in your clan was murdered, the clan would basically appoint somebody and deputize somebody in the clan to go and find the murderer and bring about justice. And so to prevent that from happening, God, through Moses, established these cities of refuge where you could go and basically await a trial rather than having to fear the avenger from the clan coming after you. And so you see in this portion dealing with the Sixth Commandment, the laws of the city of refuge, the laws in terms of warfare in chapter 20, of what all of that looks like. And then you also see the atonement in chapter 21, atonement for unsolved murders. Or what are you to do in terms of cleansing the land from unsolved murders? And so there's quite a bit there. In chapter 22, verse 9 through 20 through 18, you're going to have an exposition of the Seventh Commandment, which is going to be dealing with adultery and ultimately also human dignity. And you're going to see principles of, if you look at the beginning of that portion, 22:9, you shall not sow your vineyard with two kinds of seed, lest all the produce of the seed which you have sown and the increase of your vineyard become defiled. You shall not plow with an ox and a donkey together. You shall not wear a material mixed of wool and flax together. You shall make yourselves tassels on the four corners of your garments with which you cover yourself. All of those things are pointing and reminding the Israel that they are to live purely and faithfully within their covenant relationship of marriage. And then in beginning in verse 13 and 22, you see laws about sexual immorality. So you see Moses is teaching through systematically these 10 commandments with significant implications on all of it. So in 23:19 through 24:7, you see an exposition of the 8th commandment on theft and again on human dignity. And if you look at where this begins, 23:19, you shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money, food, or anything that may be loaned at interest. And you may charge interest to a foreigner, but to your brother you shall not charge interest, so that Yahweh your God may bless you in all that you send forth your hand to do in the land which you are about to enter to possess. So think this through. What's one application of the command that you shall not steal, right? But when you loan money to somebody else, it's possible to extort from them exorbitant amounts of interest, known as usury, right? And that's under this concept of not stealing from others. And part of the application is not taking advantage when they are in need and oppressing them. And so these are the kinds of laws that are unfolded here throughout this exposition of the 10 commandments. If you look at chapter 24, verse 8 through 25:4, there's an exposition of the Ninth Commandment. We're dealing with false charges and with dignity. And this is where sometimes it challenges you to think through things. And there's different views on where some of these divisions are, because sometimes there's a little bit of overlap. But look at 24, beginning in verse 8. So I would say this is beginning to deal with false charges and with dignity. But it begins in an interesting way. It says, take care, so 24:8, take care against an infection of leprosy, to be careful and to do according to all that the Levitical priests instruct you, as I have commanded them. So you shall be careful to do. Then verse 9, remember that Yahweh your God, what Yahweh your God did to Miriam on the way as you came out of Egypt. Now, I'm saying this is the portion dealing with false charges, and then he begins with leprosy in verse 8. But what's the connection with verse 9? Verse 9 is important. What did Miriam do? Why did she get cast or struck with leprosy by the Lord? She brought false charges against Moses. And so you see, again, the connection. So every so often, Moses, inspired by the Spirit, will make these connections of keep this in mind. Don't press false charges, because that Miriam bringing false charges against Moses and then God immediately striking her with leprosy is a picture of God's justice, right? If you're going to bring false charges, keep this in mind. You may not be able to be proven and condemned guilty of false charges before a human court, but guess who sees and knows everything? God. And he will bring judgment to the situation. And then 25 verses verse 5 through 26:15 are really dealing with coveting. And a part of that also it picks up the idea of offering their first fruits and their tithes, and not being greedy and holding on, but making sure to give to the Lord what belongs to the Lord. So it's amazing to see how Moses just builds upon the 10 Commandments there and unfolds all of that. And then he comes to a closing exhortation in verses 16 through 19 of 26. And it's going to be a lot of those same themes that we have already picked up on, of their relationship with Yahweh. Verse 16 in chapter 26, this day Yahweh your God is going to command these statutes, and they are to obey them. They are to follow through with obedience of what God has spoken. And then in verses 27 and 28, or chapters 27 and 28 rather, are going to lay out the blessings and the curse of the covenant. Okay, this is the Mosaic Covenant was a conditional covenant, which was different from the other covenants that God established with Israel, with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, with David, and ultimately with Israel in the New Covenant. The Mosaic Covenant was conditional, that if you do this, there's going to be a result. If they obey, they're going to be blessed, and they won't be able to outrun the blessings. The blessings will overtake them, and if they disobey, they won't be able to outrun the curse that comes upon them. The curse will overtake them. And so if you read chapter 28 in Deuteronomy, you will actually see the future history of Israel, of everything that's going to take place was promised ahead of time in 1406. So everything that's going to happen later on over the course of the next 700 years through the end of the two nations, in terms of the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, all of that was predicted by Moses. And he's going to tie it into their disobedience and their covenant unfaithfulness to Yahweh. And then we come to chapter 29. And chapter 29 begins that final section of the book of looking to the future of what God will do. And 29:1 shows that God is going to make a different covenant with the nation of Israel. It says, these are the words of the covenant which Yahweh commanded Moses to cut with the sons of Israel in the land of Moab, besides the covenant which he had cut with them at Horeb. And Horeb is just another name for Mount Sinai. So here we have a different covenant. So he says, yes, God made a covenant with you at Sinai, but now there's going to be a different one. If you look at verse 4, again, this is going to be, this portion of the book, Moses is going to be predicting that Israel is going to experience a lot more of the curse than they are of the blessing. He gives the reason for that in chapter 29, verse 4. Yet to this day, Yahweh has not given you a heart to know, nor eyes to see, nor ears to hear. All right, back in chapter 10, Israel was commanded to circumcise their heart, but Moses says, yeah, that hasn't happened yet. God has to do that, and he hasn't given you that heart yet. He's going to predict unfaithfulness. If you look at verse 22 in chapter 29, and the generation to come, your sons who rise up after you, and the foreigner who comes from a distant land, shall see the plagues of the land and the diseases with which Yahweh has afflicted it. And they will say, all its land is brimstone and salt, a burning waste, unsown, and nothing sprouting, and no grass grows in it, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which Yahweh overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. So Moses is predicting and expecting God's judgment to come upon Israel in the same way that it came upon Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 25, the men will say, because they forsook the covenant of Yahweh, the God of their fathers, which he cut with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they went and served other gods and worshipped them, gods whom they have not known and whom he had not apportioned to them. Therefore the anger of Yahweh was kindled against that land to bring about its every curse which is written in this book. And Yahweh uprooted them from their land in anger and in fury and in great wrath, and he cast them into another land, as it is this day. And then Israel might ask and wrestle with this, like, but wait, if he is the Lord our God, and he's chosen us and blessed us and said he's going to be gracious to us, how can this type of judgment be promised and expected against us? Well, what does Deuteronomy 29:29 say? The secret things belong to Yahweh our God, but the things revealed to us belong to us and to our sons forever, that we may do all the words of this law. There's going to be some things that Israel doesn't understand, but what has been revealed to them, they are capable of understanding, and they are expected to act upon what has been revealed. Chapter 30 then, verse 1, so it will be when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I have set before you, and you cause these things to return to your heart in all the nations where Yahweh your God has banished you. And you return to Yahweh your God, and listen to his voice with all your heart and soul, according to all that I am commanding you today, you and your sons. Then Yahweh your God will return you from captivity and return his compassion on you. And he will gather you again from all the peoples where Yahweh your God has scattered you. If those of you who are banished are at the ends of the sky, from there Yahweh your God will gather you, and from there he will take you back. And Yahweh your God will bring you into the land which your fathers possessed, and you shall possess it. And he will prosper you and multiply you more than your fathers. Moreover, Yahweh your God will circumcise your heart and the heart of your seed to love Yahweh your God with all your heart and with all your soul, so that you may live. See, those are new covenant promises, that God will bring the nation of Israel back to the land, and that they will have a new heart to obey him. And actually the emphasis of Ezra and Nehemiah is that even though God has brought them back into the land, what do we still see? We still see Israel committing the same sins. So they've been brought back to the land, but they don't have the new heart. How should we view Israel today? They're in the land, but what are they still lacking? That heart to follow after God. They don't have that. They still reject their Messiah, and they have no heart to actually follow and obey God. And so Moses lays all of that out and expects covenant disobedience from Israel. Then in chapters 31 and 32, Moses is a portion of Scripture known as the Song of Moses. This is going to be Moses explaining and predicting again in a poetic form what he said in 29 and 30, that he is expecting covenant unfaithfulness. And Moses is 120 years old today. He spent 40 years in Egypt. He committed a murder. Then he had to flee for his life. He spent 40 years in the wilderness as a shepherd over, I think, in Midian. And then he spent 40 years leading the people of Israel. So think about that. How would you like to lead a nation between the years 80 and 120? That sounds exhausting, right? But that's what God called Moses to. And in that portion, Moses is going to be establishing Joshua as his successor. And then if you look at 31, verse 28 and 29, this is a key passage because this is where we get our threefold division of the Torah. That on 3 separate occasions in the Pentateuch, or in those first 5 books, there's a situation where the main character calls for people to gather. He says, assemble to me, that I may speak to you and proclaim to you things pertaining to the end of days, to the last days. And Jacob did this in Genesis 49 as he blessed his sons. You can go back and look there, 49:1. He says, let me tell you what's going to happen in the latter days. As we saw last week with the false prophet Balaam. Even though he was a false prophet, God used him in a true way to proclaim things dealing with the end times and looking forward to the future. And so Balaam does that in Numbers 24. Verse 14, where he's going to say to Balak, the king of Moab, assemble together and I'm going to tell you what Israel is going to do to your people in the end days. And Moses is going to do the same thing here. In verse 28 of chapter 31, assemble to me all the elders of your tribes and your officers, that I may speak these words in their hearing, and call the heavens and the earth to witness against them. For I know that after my death you will act corruptly and turn away from the way which I have commanded you, and evil will befall you in the last days. For you will do that which is evil in the sight of Yahweh, provoking him to anger with the work of your hands. And then in his chapter 32, the Song of Moses, Moses is going to predict unfaithfulness. But look at verse 21. It says, they have made me jealous with what is not God. And this is Moses, or God speaking through Moses to the people. They is Israel, and me is God. They have made me jealous with what is not God, and they have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are not a people, and I will provoke them to anger with a wickedly foolish nation. So what is Moses predicting? What is God saying? Because of Israel's rejection, he would go to the Gentiles. So Moses is writing about Gentile inclusion in salvation and in the plan of God way back in Deuteronomy. And that's going to be cited in Romans 9, 10, and 11 by the Apostle Paul, saying that this is all a part of God's plan. But then look at that same chapter, look at verse 43 or 36. For Yahweh will render justice to his people and will have compassion on his slaves. So even though Israel was unfaithful, that doesn't mean that God is done with Israel. And then verse 43, O nations, cause his people to shout for joy, for he will avenge the blood of his slaves, and he will render vengeance on his adversaries, and he will atone for his land and his people. So God is going to bring them back, and he's going to restore them. And so you have that song of Moses, and then the blessing of Moses upon the tribes of Israel in chapter 33, similar to what Jacob did in Genesis 49. And then chapter 34, you have the death of Moses. You have Moses going up to the top of Mount Nebo, looking at the land that Israel was going to enter into. And then verse 7, now Moses was 120 years old when he died, and his eye was not dim, nor was his vigor abated. He was in good health. Again, why was Moses' life taken from him at that time? Because he treated God as unholy in front of the entire congregation. And again, sobering reality there. And then verse 8, so the sons of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days, and then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses came to an end. And Joshua, the son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands on him, and the sons of Israel listened to him and did as Yahweh had commanded Moses. They obeyed. And there has not yet arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom Yahweh knew face to face in regard to all the signs and wonders which Yahweh sent him to do in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh, all his servants and all his land, and in regard to all the mighty power, and in regard to all the great terror which Moses did in the sight of Israel. And so Moses was always viewed as the greatest prophet. So that's important to keep in mind as Jesus comes onto the scene and speaks about Moses talking about him to the Jewish leaders. The Jewish leaders would have been, what? I mean, Moses was the ultimate prophet, and they held him in the highest esteem. And Jesus says, no, Jesus is greater than Moses, and Moses spoke about him. It was just completely shocking. But so that was the jet tour. Any questions on Deuteronomy before we close?